As the Ministry of Housing, Lands and Rural Development strives to meet housing demand, persons residing in tenantries across Barbados are reminded that they can still apply to purchase the land they are living on. Stay tuned for the next few minutes to find out how. You'll also hear from clients of the Barbados Land Registry.
I live in Trent, Tenantry, St. James. My mom, which is her grandmother, she came from the same part too. So I lived there, went to school down there, married there, and I know I'm gonna die down there. But it's a very nice area. People are friendly and nice and everything.
Officials at the Barbados Land Registry, a department of the Ministry of Housing, Lands and Rural Development, explain what can be described as a tenantry.
A tenantry consists of 5 houses. There must be the minimum 5 houses, and each tenant must have been paying land rent on their house, but paying rent for the land.
The payment of rent is for a period of 5 to 7 years continuously. The legislation specifies certain periods of time in history and whether it's 5 or 7 years. But the general rule is if you have been paying rent for more than 5 years and you're the owner of the house, then you would be a tenant.
If you want to be sure that you are qualified, you must own the house. You must own. If you are renting the house, you cannot qualify. You must own the house and pay land rent.
It would also be useful. I've found from the legal practice that people are quite hesitant about writing wills. It would also be useful and make the process easier if you are an older tenant to actually will the property to someone so that it would be easier for them to continue the process, the qualification process, instead of the challenges that can arise and the uncertainty and in some instances not being able to convey at all. So it would be best, writing a will does not mean that you're going to pass away. So it would be best to write your wills, put your house in order, make it easy for your family.
There's also no need for the client to seek an attorney.
The Registrar of Titles and the Deputy Registrar of Titles are both attorneys at law, and they are responsible for the preparing of the conveyance, and the registrar is responsible for signing as vendor. That is one of the benefits from the government to tenants, where they do not then have to go and look for legal fees in the process. It is all done here at the Land Registry.
And they get a good and marketable title.
Good and marketable title.
Always tell them that. So
yes.
You can carry it to any lending institution and they will use it for collateral.
Yes. And lending institutions will also provide the money to purchase.
Right.
Once we provide the necessary documentation, lending institutions will provide you the money to purchase the property in the first place. Yes. Tenants should also know that they can buy the property outright. They do not have to get the government subsidy. If they wait for the government subsidy, then the legislation requires the government to have the first option to purchase that property anytime the tenant is looking to sell it. However, if you purchase the property outright without a government subsidy, you can sell that property at market value to whomever you wish after you purchase it.
After 5 years. You must keep it for 5 years. You can't do nothing with it under 5 years.
Now let's talk numbers. How much will it cost residents to purchase?
For a tenantry lot in a plantation, it is always $1. There's no value on a plantation tenantry. But with the insertion of the private tenantries and we're having a lot of private tenantries coming on stream, and for a private tenantry we have to get it valued, because we must give the landlord the market value, the benefit of the exact market value that he can get. So we have to request the Barbados Revenue Authority to do a valuation. Once they value the lots, then we give the tenant $250 per square foot, and the government subsidizes the difference. That's when it goes up to 5,000 square feet. Sometimes people query the price, but It is a market value, and the valuation is the land is valued, and that is the price we go from the BRA. So, but the tenant only pays $250. So if it goes at 15, you only pay $250. So the difference is met from the government. If you have 12,000 square feet, that is not environs. Because your house part, if your house part takes only 5,000, then you are having like that's 2 in 1. So environs should be just enough to plant, to park a car, to do a kitchen garden, and that type of thing. Those are environs.
So tenants really need to know that it is your house spot and the environment.
Some people feel if I occupy this whole table, this is all. No. But if your house spot and environs is only half, then you pay $250 for that amount, and if it's $11 and the rest is 7,000 square feet, then you have to pay 11 by 7, $77,000 additional.
I would urge anybody that is in the situation where you can have access to purchasing your land, that the land registry definitely would be the place that can guide you and take you through the process, and you have no fear.
At what point does the land registry actually become a part of this process?
So the land registry only becomes a part of the process after the Ministry of Housing or Urban says that the tenant is a qualified tenant. So they are responsible for qualifying that tenant. We are responsible for conveying the land to the tenant. The registrar acts as vendor in certain circumstances that Ms. Boyce will mention to you.
When you would have submitted your Form 1 and you become a qualified tenant, but then your landlord cannot be found. You don't know where your landlord is. Maybe this is you cannot find your landlord, or your landlord is alive and he does not want to sell you that land, or he does not have an attorney. He has not appointed an attorney in connection with that particular piece of law. Then the land registry becomes vendor. They do a Form 2. They will then submit a Form 2 to the land registry. Once that Form 2 comes, along with the stamp Form 1, because they must have the stamp Form 1 saying that they are qualified to purchase, but the issues that stop me from getting my piece of land. So then they bring that stamp Form 1 and they fill a Form 2, and then we take the process from there.
What is interesting is that the Registrar of Titles have wide powers basically to act as the vendor. So whether it's a plantation tenantry or a private tenantry where a person would have rented out 5 or more house spots, if they refuse to sell it and the tenant qualifies as a tenant under the legislation, the Registrar of Title has powers under the legislation to sell that land to the tenant. The monies are then kept on trust at the land registry for when, if it's the case where the landlord cannot be found, until someone comes and say that they are the beneficiary to that estate, or if the landlord refuses to sell the land until he's ready to claim the funds that we would have received for selling the land on his behalf.
And then we look at the purchase price. Once the person becomes qualified, if you are part of a plantation tenantry, you pay $1 per square meter or 10 cents per square foot. You pay all the money yourself. Now with a private tenantry, the Act provides for the lot to be sold at the market value, but the tenant pays $250 per square foot, and then the government subsidizes the balance of the money.
So if you are in a private tenantry and you and when the land has been valued and you are on, say, 8,000 square feet, you would pay $250 up to the first 5,000, and the government will pay the remainder up to the 5,000, and then you will pay market value for the extra 3,000.
What happens if there are less than 5 house spots being rented out?
The Act provides that if you have less than 5 house spots, then you qualify in your own right. So we have to look at the number of years you were there, and like if you were there 20 years before 1990 and 70, you qualify automatically. So you can still go through the process of a tenantry and get your lot. We don't know there's a tenantry. You will determine if there's a tenantry, the person that's living on the land. So you go, you fill your form, you must take your rent receipts also. Because when you take your rent, they will realize that you'll be paying rent for the required number of years, and the Ministry of Housing or the Urban Development Commission, they are the ones who will do the investigation then for you to determine if you are qualified to purchase under the Tenantry's Freehold Purchase Act.
In some instances, though, a person may have been paying rent, say, for 30 years, and then the landlord passes away and they don't know who to pay rent to, and so for the next 15 years they were living on the land without paying rent. The Registrar of Title then must collect rent for that outstanding 15 years before he's able to convey the land to that person, because by law that rent money is still due and owing to the landlord or to the landlord's estate, and any beneficiary under that estate should get that money. And so we would collect the outstanding rents for however long that is, and then we will go through the process of conveying.
So once the client qualifies, what's next?
Once the person becomes qualified, and so they bring their stamp form 1, because the Ministry or Urban must send that form 1 back to them, the stamp form 1. They bring that form 1, and then we supply them with form 2s, 2 form 2s that's done a duplicate, and then fill that form 2. Once the form 2 is filled, we then request from Urban or the Ministry the key plan and the lot plan. They're supposed to get the land surveyor to do the key and the lot plan and submit that to us. The land then is valued by Barbados Revenue Authority, and then once we get that value, then we communicate that to the tenant. The tenant has 3 years to pay their portion of the purchase price if a subsidy is involved. If a subsidy is not involved, then they still have the choice to pay the full purchase price. So the land registry acts as the person. We collect all the outstanding land rent, we collect the money for the purchase price, and then once everything is paid, because you must pay everything to the land registry before we can do a conveyance. Once all the monies are in, all the rents are in, then we prepare the conveyance.
A tenant should not worry too much though if they have paid their purchase price and 3 years expires because they're waiting for the Ministry of Housing or Urban to pay a subsidy on their behalf. Sometimes, obviously, because of economic conditions or whatever the case may be, a subsidy may not be able to be paid on their behalf right away. And so even though they would have paid their full purchase price, well, their portion of the purchase price, and 3 years expires, the tenant will still be able to buy that lot once the subsidy has been paid. However, if they are paying it for it outright, they must pay it within the 3 years.
This client, who lives at Trent's Tenantry in St. James, describes her experience working with the land registry.
They kept us abreast at every stage when they got in contact, and then basically landlord had agreed to sell the land. But even prior to that, before we even get there, just one thing, we had to produce our rent book, because my grandmother had a rent book that she used to pay rent to a lady in the district. And when the lady died, I would have paid the rent to Rick's supermarket, because my mom also lives in Trent Tenantry, but her plot was not necessarily tenantry. She would have made a deposit onto a piece of land. However, there were some things that took a little bit longer, and what we did, in the same time my grandmother got through, I also mentioned to Mrs. Boyce, so my mom is having some issues with her acquisition of her land, and we were able then to get some guidance. So we're actually coming on to the end of that purchase.
Yeah, my lawyer died. And it was a whole set of things, so we went to Mrs. Boy, and she showed us the right channel where to go through, and tell us what to do and everything.
Staff at the Barbados Land Registry are willing to work with you to answer your questions on tenantries and other matters relating to land in Barbados. Give them a call at 310-1100.
But I want to say thanks to them, because, without them and the Miller family, Roger Miller would have been the landlord. The whole family would not have been able to own our land in Trent St. James. I'm very happy to say that my grandmother was able to own her land before she died.